Chapter 15. X. The man behind me was named Mikos. Next to him was Boris, who had been badly cut up by shrapnel. From them, and from Nikolai in the bed next to mine, I learned that I was in the village of Algheni, about 40 kilometers or so from Tarnopol, in a schoolhouse that had been converted into a hospital. The place had 5 rooms. 3 were used as wards, 1 as a kitchen and dispensary, and the last as an operating room. My terror at being found out continued to gnaw at me, though no one seemed the least bit suspicious. I did make one small mistake, but even this went almost unnoticed. I told Boris that my knee was pounding. Instead of the word knee, kalyena, I said bidro, which means hip. Boris asked if I had been wounded in the hip as well. Niet, I told him no, struggling to keep the nerves out of my voice, but I must have twisted it or hurt it a bit somehow. He nodded. As the day passed, I settled into the hospital routine. Breakfast was around 7. For me, because of my abdominal wound, this usually consisted of bread, tea, and shi, cabbage soup. For the others, there was always fresh fruit from nearby orchards, mishtsas, a type of muffin, and sometimes yetsa I shmiatku, soft-boiled eggs and sausage. But even before breakfast was served, there were countless other tasks that had to be attended to by the orderlies, nurses, orderlies, and other staff members. The converted classroom rang out with calls from the men. "Nurse, please, a shot for the pain." "Hey, you, comrade, water. Please, I'm going to die of thirst." "Please, somebody, a bedpan." The last of these was the most common morning call, and orderlies would hurry to the men and bring German helmets for them to relieve themselves in, probably collected after some previous battle. The helmets were what were used as bedpans. Using them for this bothered me at first, but after a while I got used to it and hardly gave it a thought. The staff worked endless hours trying to take care of the hundreds or so patients in the place. They usually looked haggard and totally exhausted from the never-ending chores that had to be done, changing our dressings and feeding, bathing, and cleaning up after us. They also had to get recovering patients up out of bed and back on their feet. As far as the military was concerned, the idea was to send these men back to the front. But, being short-handed at the hospital, the doctors kept many on as long as possible to help out. The hospital had only 2 doctors, Dr. Swarov, the man with the bushy white hair I'd seen on my first day, and Dr. Rostovic, a nervous little man whose eyes always looked frozen wide with anxiety. We saw very little of our doctors or of the skilled nurses. From dawn to dusk, and sometimes far into the night, they were in the operating room doing surgery. Taking care of the patients in the ward was left mostly to male orderlies and volunteer nurses from the village of Algheni, few of whom had any real medical training. In charge of the ward staff was Zoya, a stocky woman with a booming growl of a voice. Katerina, the blonde nurse with the alabaster skin, was Zoya's niece. She wasn't at all like her aunt, slender and delicate. She spoke so softly it was often hard to make out what she was saying. Lena, also blonde, was a tireless worker very efficient. Despite the fact that she was so short, she had to drag around a box to stand on when she was working at the bedside of a patient. Marussia was a somewhat dull-witted and clumsy girl who always seemed to be making a mess of things. But because she had a beautiful face and figure, almost all the men seemed to be in love with her. Tamara, the youngest of the unskilled nurses, had long brown hair that reached almost to her waist, dark, mysterious eyes, and a gentle smile. She lived with Zoya and Katerina. Reuben was the head orderly. He was easygoing, well-liked by the patients and the rest of the staff, except Zoya, who always seemed to be finding fault with him. Vlad and Oleg, half-brothers, and both as big and strong as bears, were the only male orderlies who worked at the hospital on a permanent basis. The rest were recovering patients. We also had a single guard for the hospital, Sergo, with a dented, surgically scarred forehead. Sergo was a former patient, and so badly brain damaged he had been declared unfit for military service, but had taken it upon himself to play soldier guarding the hospital. During a German offensive, Algheni had been attacked and briefly occupied. Most of the inhabitants had fled eastward, abandoning the town. A death-like stillness seemed to hang over the place. The window near my bed framed a stretch of dreary-looking wood houses and buildings, and beyond that a pine-forested mountainside. Directly across the way were a stable, an abandoned dry goods shop, and an extremely small house with a green door that forever hung cockeyed on its hinges. Often, in the roadway between the schoolhouse hospital and these buildings, I would see our guard, Sergo, by himself, rifle on his shoulder. He either stood at attention or marched back and forth. Other than to groan, feel miserable, and sleep, there was little for us to do to pass the time except talk. Mostly the patients talked about their homes and families, about the work that they had done before the war, and about things that had happened to them on the battlefield, especially about how they had been wounded. Nikolai, in his plaster pants, had been wounded in both legs when his battalion had accidentally been bombarded by their own troops using Stalin organs, multiple rocket launchers. Mikos had been shot twice in the stomach trying to get to a wounded comrade. Boris had been a few meters from a soldier who had stepped on a mine. The other soldier had been killed. Boris, though badly injured by the blast, had somehow managed to make his way on his own to an aid station several kilometers to the rear. My story was probably the strangest of all, but of course I could not tell it. I could only lie and say that I had trouble remembering anything. The others started guessing where I was from, which made me nervous. In Russia, there are dozens of ethnic groups, and countless languages and dialects are spoken. Because of my blonde hair, blue eyes, and manner of speaking, it was the consensus that I was either from Silesia or Odessa. I did nothing to dispel this conclusion and thanked them for trying to help. With everything locked up inside of me, I thought constantly of home, of my mother and grandparents, and of Hals and Oscar and of Jacob, Willie, Fastnacht, and Dobelman. And then there was the soldier, Alexander, whose uniform I had taken. I said as little as possible and mostly just lay looking up at the ceiling of white, peeling paint. It looked like dead, flaking skin. Every part of me hurt, and I was so scared and lonely and lost that I often felt like crying. If it hadn't been for Nikolai, I don't think I would have made it. Nikolai, who had a wife and 2 young sons back home, was to me like the father I'd never known. He talked to me a lot and always had a smile and an encouraging word for me. Another thing I received from him was a new name. I hated being called Alexander or Alex, and I told him so. He began calling me X. It suits you, he said. I agree.